John Law was born in 1671 in Edinburgh, Scotland, into a family of goldsmiths. Goldsmithing involved working with gold and other metals like silver to craft jewelry and other utensils. The thing is that by the late 17th century, goldsmithing held a fairly elevated status compared to other guilds. Why? Because many goldsmiths had discovered the business far more lucrative than jewelry making, that is, lending money. In an era where money mainly meant gold and silver coins, goldsmiths cleverly took advantage of their positions to profit from giving out loans. And that was the business that little John grew up around, absorbing it from childhood. Something that likely sparked his interest in economics and finance. On the other hand, John's father was determined to give his sons an education worthy of gentlemen. So he enrolled them in the Edinburgh High School. There, the teachers quickly noticed that young John was exceptionally intelligent and possessed a remarkable talent for numbers. But beyond his brains, John Law had a special talent for socializing. He was very charismatic. He had this charm. As he grew into a man, people would recognize him, especially for his height, over 6 feet tall, his flair for stylish clothes, and above all, his magnetic personality, which helped him make friends wherever he went. Before even finishing his studies at the Edinburgh High School, John was already using that charm to enjoy life's pleasures, women, and gambling. He was just a simple man. But then one day his father died, and his mother, noticing that the boy was going a bit off the rails, decided to get him out of the city. She practically exiled him to a small town called Eaglesham, in order or with the objective to distance him from temptation and keep him from wasting his talent that, remember, was numbers and this charming personality. However, young John was an addict, and I don't blame him. Not only did he not stay in the village, he went to an even bigger city filled with more temptations, the big London. In the great city, he used his math skills to earn money playing cards and his social skills to make well-connected friends and to get under more than a few skirts. That, of course, earned him some enemies too, like the infamous Edward Wilson. According to the stories, Edward Wilson challenged John Law to a duel over a woman. Her name was Elizabeth Billiards. Actually, love has shaped a lot of things along history. There are empires that have fallen because of love, wars that have been fought only for love, and men who died just for a single kiss of the woman they admired. Whatever the case, the two met one day in Brucebury Square, a well-known spot where nobles met to settle their difference in duels, and where Law killed Wilson. Duels were fairly common at the time. They were this noble way to settle insults and display this one's honor, but just because they were common didn't mean that they were legal. In fact, they weren't. Unfortunately for Law, Wilson's family had a lot of influence and a lot of power, so he was thrown into Newgate prison and sentenced to death. And that is the end of John Law. Nah, just kidding. We must see how he ruined France, but before we continue, if you're liking this video so far, please subscribe for more content like this. In January 1695, a good friend of John Law, the Earl of Warriston, used his influence to secure him a royal pardon. Apparently, the king had already been bought off by the Wilson family, so he couldn't fully pardon him. But at least he commuted the death sentence and had him transferred to the King's Bench prison, a far better place than Newgate. Then Warriston pulled out his wallet and hired 2 thugs. They slipped into the prison, dragged the guards, freed Law from his shackles, and discreetly smuggled him out, eventually getting him aboard a ship. Europe was about to receive the Scottish genius and his ideas, with all the consequences that would entail. Law's first years on the continent were, well, probably not that different from his life in England. Frequenting gambling halls, seducing women, and using his magnetic personality to win over people of influence. He visited Paris, Amsterdam, Venice, Genoa, and Turin. In every city, he made money thanks to his extraordinary gambling skills, which were grounded in his deep knowledge of mathematics and probability. By the way, if you want me to teach you how to gain an edge in the casino thanks to probability, let me know down in the comments in order for me to make a video on the topic. But well, the key moment of his European journey came in the city of Amsterdam. There, he encountered the Amsterdamse Banque, the Banque of Amsterdam. The workings of this institution fascinated John Law. At the time, coin debasement was a widespread problem. By adulterating coins, one could extract a percentage of the gold content to mint more coins. A coin might bear a face value, but in reality it contained far less gold, so its true value wasn't as high. Many opportunists took advantage of this trick to make money, but actually the first to engage in coin debasement were often governments themselves as a way to increase their money supply and their richness overall. But actually we know that this isn't true because there is this phenomenon called inflation. But well, they didn't know that at the epoch. In response, the Bank of Amsterdam came up with a practical solution. It accepted coins of all kinds, both local and foreign, then weighted them, assessed their purity, and issued paper money in exchange. Paper money, or if you prefer banknotes, represented the intrinsic value of the metal rather than the face value stamped on the coin. So basically the weight of the metal, in this case gold, silver, whatever. The Bank of Amsterdam wasn't the first to invent paper money. In fact, the Chinese had already done that back in the 7th century. But what made the Bank of Amsterdam stand out was one critical factor, that was trust. The bank had a strict policy of never issuing a banknote that wasn't backed by actual metal reserves, and for that reason people trusted it. John was so fascinated by this that during his travels, he spent hours inside other banks operating similarly to the Bank of Amsterdam. He would spend hours and hours watching and studying the immense practicality of paper money, how citizens use it for trade, for investment, for currency exchange. He observed the convenience it brought to daily transactions. And after 10 years of economic research, John Law had acquired a lot of financial wisdom, along with a total of £20,000 of savings amassed through gambling, money lending, and foreign currency trading. Yeah, like your typical guru. By then, this Scotsman had already changed a lot. That reckless womanizing young man had transformed into someone ambitious and driven. He had a vision to become the key of Europe's financial evolution, and he decided that this evolution had to begin in his homeland, Scotland. John Law arrived in Scotland in 1704, but he had to be careful as he was still a fugitive in England. Although his legal status in Scotland was something of a grey area, because while both nations were under the same monarch, Scotland still had its own government, which meant that Law couldn't be arrested for a crime committed in London. But still, he needed to obtain a royal pardon. But by that time, King William had died and had been succeeded by Queen Anne. So he got to work. Eager to contribute to the kingdom's prosperity, Law offered his financial expertise to the Queen in a proposal he titled Essay on a Land Bank. This was, it seems, Law's first official work. In it, he proposed the creation of a bank that would issue paper money backed not by silver, but by land. Land, he argued, was a more stable foundation for credit since history had shown that the value of precious metals could fluctuate based on scarcity, whereas land retained a more consistent value overall in history. It seemed like a good idea, but it wasn't entirely original. By the mid-17th century, several writers had proposed similar schemes. Still, Law believed in his essay, so he sent it to Queen Anne and awaited for her reply. And her reply was a resounding no. The Queen didn't even think of handing the kingdom financial reins to a fugitive. And to make matters worse, she added that if he wanted to earn a royal pardon, she'd be happy to see him offer his services on the battlefield. At that time, England was in a war with the Spanish. He rather stood firm in his belief that his theories had merit. He remained in Scotland and decided that he would at least try to improve the economic condition of his own people. At the time, Scotland was in the grips of a severe crisis, and John Law believed that he could be part of the solution. So he wrote a second essay, Money and Trade Considered, with a proposal for supplying the nation with money. To be honest, a big-ass title. In the future, economists would admire the extraordinary clarity and simplicity with which this text or this book explained key concepts like the value of things.
Water is extremely useful, yet it has little value. because the quantity of water far exceeds the demand for it. Diamonds, on the other hand, are of little use, yet have great value, because their demand far outweighs their supply.
And regarding money, he wrote,
Money is not the value for which goods are exchanged, but the value by which they are exchanged. Money's purpose is to buy goods, and silver, as money, has no other use.
For Law, the key was this: money was simply a medium to fulfill a function with no intrinsic value beyond what backed it, and he proposed that backing should be land. His ideas eventually made it to the Scottish Parliament, but they were basically rejected. Rejected by the Queen of England, rejected by the Scottish Parliament, John Law had no choice but to pack his bags and pitch his proposal to a different king, the King of France. When Law arrived in France, Louis XIV had already ruled for decades. He had led the country to unprecedented glory, becoming the envy of all Europe. Then, he rented himself with relentless wars, religious persecutions, and an extravagance that knew no limits. Yes, he's the one who made the Palace of Versailles, and he is known throughout history as Le Roi Soleil, or the Sun King. One of the final wars to drain France's treasury had been the very same war of the Spanish succession, in which they have fought, amongst others, against England. Maybe that's why when some nobles that saw the Scottish stranger hanging around the gambling halls of Paris, they started whispering that he was a spy. But nothing could be farther from the truth. John Law was simply observing how France tried desperately to rebuild his finances. New taxes were introduced, old ones were raised, but none of it seemed to work. And Law knew he had the answer.
And trade and money are mutually dependent. When trade falls, money diminishes. And when money diminishes, trade collapses.
In his view, the only way to break this vicious cycle was to increase the money supply. But with gold and silver in the short supply, the solution was clear to him: create a national bank, issue paper money, and put it into circulation. A great idea, once again, rejected. But before leaving, he made sure to visit a few gambling halls in Paris, places where he had always felt like home. Perhaps it was there that he met the king's nephew, Philippe II, Duc d'Orléans. The two became friends almost instantly. They had plenty in common. And so, despite all the rejections, Law had finally found someone with both the intellect and the vision to truly understand his ideas. Law continued traveling through Europe and eventually arrived in Rotterdam, Holland. There, for a while, he forgot about using his knowledge to help others and decided to help himself instead. Using his knowledge on risk management, he devised an insurance scheme for lottery players, making around 500,000 pounds or sterling pounds. But apparently, the Dutch authorities weren't exactly thrilled with this scheme and politely asked him to leave the country. Once again, rejected. Though this time he was filthy rich. In Spanish we say, tanto va el cántaro a la fuente que acaba por romperse, which basically means that if you chase your dreams and you keep on going and trying, in the end you'll get what you deserve, and this is the case for Mr. Law. Louis XIV, King of France, died, but their heir was still a child. So, until the boy turned 18, the French Parliament appointed a regent to rule in his state. The regent was none other than the Duke of Orleans, John Law's good friend. So our beloved friend decided to go back to Paris and try again. When the Duke of Orleans was named regent in 1715, he inherited a France in the throes of an economic disaster. The national debt was estimated at a staggering 2 trillion French livres, and some of his advisors suggested that the only solution was for France to declare bankruptcy. John Law strongly disagreed. He convinced the regent to not go down that road. In Law's view, the solution was to create a national bank that would issue paper money backed by gold and silver coins and land to offset the scarcity of these metals and stimulate commerce. The Duke of Orleans was intrigued by his friend's ideas, but he also had to answer to the parliament that had placed him in power. And it's worth mentioning that not everyone in the government liked John Law. For example, the French Minister of Finance, the Duke of Noailles, reviewed these Scottish outsiders' growing influence over the regent with increasing, suspicion. But in the end, the Duke of Orleans found a way to support his friend without provoking too much political backlash. He granted John Law a license to open a bank, but not a central one. It would be a private institution. And so in 1716, the Banque Générale privée was born. John Law's ideas had finally seen the light of day, and the beginning was an absolute failure. To raise capital, the bank issued 1,200 shares but barely managed to sell a quarter of them. The press wasn't kind to him either. To many, he was still just an untrustworthy foreigner, a gambler, and a smooth-talking fraud. So he basically had to gain this public trust, and that would be his first move. He knew that if he wanted to people trust him, so for people trusting him, he had to prove that he had the full support of the regent. His second move was to make paper money more appealing. Only a fool wouldn't use it. Law launched an aggressive strategy, offering free or extremely low-cost banking services. He let people transfer money from Paris to the provinces without fees. On top of that, the banknotes issued by Law's bank had only one key feature. They could be redeemed at any time for the coin value they represented on the date of issue. So, even if coins lost value later on, the notes retained their worth. A promise that actually the public loved because it was not just paper, it was something backed with real things, with gold, with silver and all these metals. And for the first time, John Law's bank was working and his projects were working and flourishing. It basically crushed all the other private bankers in Paris, and actually they didn't take it well. Those bankers secretly pooled their resources and amassed 5 million livres worth of Law's banknotes. Basically 5 million banknotes. He walked into the bank's office, pulled out the notes and said, "Bonjour, we'd like to exchange these coins, s'il vous plaît." Now remember, Law's entire system depended on trust that his banknotes could be exchanged for coins at any time. If he couldn't uphold that promise, the public would immediately lose faith in his currency. But what was the harsh truth? Law's reserves weren't even as close to covering 5 million livres in coins. It turned out that the Scotsman had printed more paper money than he had gold and silver to back it. That money was not backed by anything, and his competitors had spotted this flaw and found a way to destroy him. That very same day, he told them that he needed around 24 hours to gather such a large amount of coins. Then he rushed to meet with the Minister of Noailles, a man who didn't like John Law, as we said just seconds before. But as everyone knows, interest is greater than personal relationships, and in this case, the success of Law's bank had taken enormous pressure off the ministry, so much of that Noailles himself was now personally invested in saving it. Without hesitation, he ordered the minting of the coins Law needed. The next day, when Law's rivals returned to the bank, they were met with an unpleasant surprise. John Law had beaten them. He had the money. His theories were proving correct. He was reviving the French economy, and now an arrogant version of himself wrote the following lines to his old friend.
The bank is not even the greatest of my ideas. I will launch a project that will bring such prosperity to France that it will astonish all of Europe.
He was talking about the Mississippi Company. This was the beginning of Law's enormous vision. The Mississippi Company. Italians, Spaniards, Portuguese, Dutch, and English all had amassed enormous fortunes through trade with the Indies, Africa, and the Americas. And now it was France's turn. Until then, France had made very little progress inland. One of its most notorious colonial failures was the expedition of Robert Cavelier de la Salle, who reached the Mississippi in 1682, and he was about to found a colony in the state of Louisiana. Then he was assassinated. Later, private companies had tried to cover that task, but none of them succeeded, and that became John Law's golden opportunity. He secured exclusive rights to conduct all trades between France and the colony of Louisiana for the next 25 years, along with the authority to maintain his own army and navy, to mine and to farm. And just like that, the Mississippi Company was born. To finance it, Law issued 200,000 shares open for purchase by any French citizen. Anyone could be part of the company's success and make a lot of freaking money to stop being a brokey. And one of the key elements was, once again, that shares could be partially purchased using state debt bonds, which basically was doing the crown a massive favor. This had two major consequences. On one hand, Law's new project again got off to a rough start, as the French public was still unfamiliar with these joint stock companies, so the company failed to raise as much capital as they had hoped. On the other hand, Law's Banque and company were helping the crown so much that the Duke of Orleans decided it was time to convert the Banque Générale into the Banque Royale, essentially the equivalent of nationalizing the institution. John Law now had his national bank, and with it even more power to expand his system. To make sure everybody used his paper money, a new regulation was introduced. Any transaction over 600 livres had to be carried out either in gold or in paper currency. But which was the catch? Well, there was a severe shortage of gold, which meant that people could only use paper. With his influence growing by the day, Law began acquiring exclusive rights and privileges. First, the right to grow tobacco in the colonies. Second, the right to trade in slaves and other goods from Générale. And most importantly, the right to trade with the East Indies. John Law was no longer just a banker or a theorist, he was building an empire. The company's second share, insurance, was a resounding success. Initially sold at 550 livres, the shares were trading at 650 livres within a couple months. Then more were issued at 1,000 livres, at then 3,500, then 5,000, and every single offering sold out completely. It was a crazy bull run, an euphoric market growing incredibly rapid. With a simple but potent financial mechanism, people could buy shares of the Mississippi Company using money borrowed directly from Law's bank. Naturally, this was paper money, no longer backed by any precious metals. Well, as a crypto bro that I am, this reminds me of what happened in 2022 with the cryptocurrency Terra Luna. Damn, that was crazy. Let me know if you want a video on that on the comments, but it was, well, basically doing the same but with a cryptocurrency instead of paper money. And, well, it ended pretty badly for the investors. But basically, this created a self-feeding loop of speculation. The more shares people bought, the higher the price climbed, which attracted more investors who borrowed more money to buy more shares, and so on, so on, so on. Basically, it's a bubble. By 1719, the Mississippi Company share had soared to 10,000 livres. And by 1720, John Law was appointed by his friend, the Duke of Orleans, as the Controller General of France's finances, the most powerful economic position in the kingdom. Newspapers began publishing stories of ordinary citizens becoming rich overnight, some of them beyond imagination. By the way, from my personal experience, when this happens, it is time to start selling whatever you bought. And with this, a new world entered the French language. A word to describe this lucky thief who struck gold off the streets of Paris. Millionaire. And there was the origin of the word millionaire that we all know right now. Meanwhile, in Louisiana, the reality was far from the dreams sold in Paris. The settlers were fighting for their lives. In 1719, during a brutal attack, native tribes raided the homes of 1,500 French colonists and slaughtered them all. To the west, they faced the threat of Spanish settlements. To the east, the looming presence of the British. And if other men didn't kill them, hunger, malaria, dynasty, and yellow fever were waiting to finish the job. They'll find no silver, no gold, no emeralds, only death and illnesses. The Mississippi Company was, in truth, a complete failure. And it lasted as long as it did partly because of the communication in those days was slow and limited. To take that into account, took more or less 4 months to grab a ship from one point and go to the other. So the news were very slow. 4 months. In 4 months, the stock had already blown like 10 times 10. For most people, their only source of information came from the clever propaganda spread by John Law. But this propaganda couldn't last forever, because as some people returned from the expedition exhausted and disillusioned, people started selling all of their shares, creating a chain reaction. The share price dropped, more and more people rushed to, cash out. But they didn't want paper, they wanted gold and silver. In desperation, Law implemented emergency measures. He limited the amount of gold and silver that could be redeemed. He devalued the share price, he devalued the paper money itself, which, was not a very good idea. And overall, he started seeing how his project was starting to vanish. Chaos erupted in Paris. There were robberies, kidnaps, murders driven by greed, envy, and the wild swings between unimaginable gains and the catastrophic losses. Investors who had lost everything began throwing stones at John Law's house and harassing his family. The situation was driving him completely out of his mind. By then, the parliament wanted his head, and the Duke of Orleans was caught between his loyalty towards his French and the public outrage. But Law feared that his friend would abandon him. But in the end, he didn't. Finally, with the regent's permission and the set of forged passports, John Law fled France with his son. He went first to Brussels, then to London, where he had already been granted a royal pardon. I mean, if you kind of ruin your most important rival's country, I would also pardon you, not gonna lie. I mean, if I was the King of England and he caused this big-ass crisis, I would already have pardoned him a long time ago. So in the end, he went to Italy and spent his final years in Venice, frequenting gambling halls and doing what he had always done best, that was betting. In the end, John Law died of pneumonia in 1729 and was buried in the Chiesa di San Moisè in Venice. Today, some might look back and label John Law as a fraud, but most historians agree that the Scotsman, far from acting out of greed or malice, genuinely believed that his system would benefit France and the French. Yet his actions began with a ruined nation and ended with a nation even more deeply ruined. The economic depression triggered by Law's system would later become one of the forces that caused one of the most important moments in history: the French Revolution of 1789. And that is it for today's video. Thank you all for being here. If you're listening to this right now, thank you, because this video actually took a lot of research, a lot of information. You have all the sources in which I've made this narrative down in the description. In this case, once again, thank you so much for watching until the end. If you like the video, drop a like, drop your comments, your thoughts down there, and also please subscribe so that I know that this video, that you like this format, and for me to keep on going and doing more things like this. Once again, thank you very much, and I'll see you in the next video. Ciao.